Hello, my dear friends, how are you? I'm Ari Theriger, and today I'm going to talk about talismans within animism, or at least an animistic understanding of what constitutes a talisman and how one is manifested when there is the need to have such objects in our possession for whichever reason or purpose. Before we start, I want to show you something. Meet Roger, my new associate. Just kidding, of course. It doesn't have a name and it needs no name at this stage. But I thought it would be interesting to bring this up. Those of you at my Instagram have already had the opportunity to catch a glimpse of this little guy. Some of you were actually very concerned about this and what it was for. and if you have watched my video about Endovelico and the sanctuary to this Celtiberian god, well, you have already seen this as well.
But at least it wasn't totally for nothing. I have actually found this root right here. I'm going to show you in more detail on another picture. Well, these roots are actually not easy to find, so it was a very fortunate finding. I'm not sure what I'm going to use it for, but it gave me inspiration actually to record the video about talismans and the creation of talismans in an animistic perception.
So when I first found this root, it immediately gave me the idea to create a talisman for myself. And I thought it would be interesting to talk about talismans, but this time involving an animistic perception and a practical action to create such an object according to that same perception. I wanted to share with you the creation of a talisman. However, the more I thought about it, I realized that I cannot actually teach you how to make a talisman and what that means in terms of animism without first explaining important aspects which I think are essential to grasp an animistic understanding towards talismans and what they are made of and what is their relation with us and why they are created in the first place, as well as the importance of objects in animism, the idea of fetishism, and in a way knowing how to differentiate between animated and inanimate objects also helps to understand why certain tools and a variety of objects and materials are so important in witchcraft as well. So, I have decided to take another approach. I cannot teach you how to make a talisman because, well, it's not simply getting an object and do something fancy with it. When it comes to animism and the creation of objects, of such objects, it involves a whole other worldview and perceptions of reality that must be taken into consideration in order for the talisman to have a meaning. Because a talisman is not an object, but it becomes instead an entity by itself with whom we build a relation. If we cannot understand this first, then we will never be able to see the talisman for what it is, and instead it remains merely an object, and therefore it will never cease to be just an object without any sort of influence in our world whatsoever. So before I start talking about talismans in animism, I need to try to explain two important factors, not just in animism, but also in the creation of a talisman. And those are personhood and relationship. Because any object, anything at all, can be a talisman. But how do we differentiate an inanimate object from an animated object? Like this set of keys. The whole set can be a talisman, or only one single key can be a talisman. But how do we know which key is a talisman and which one isn't? So what makes one object animated is precisely if it has personhood and the relationship it has with us and we with it. So how does it have personhood, or how does it gain personhood? And from the moment it has personhood, how do we create a relationship with it? So that's what we must understand first before jumping into the creation of a talisman, right? And please mind that I am not an indigenous person or a person who has been born within an animistic society. And even indigenous peoples, sadly, from them, it has also been taken away much of their traditions, their cultures, languages, and they have been subjugated to a whole other set of social and religious understandings that has had a great negative impact on their animistic worldviews and the perceptions of reality. So I'm here today as a person who is also learning about this, and I don't think I will ever stop learning and come to a point that I can say, well, that's it, I know all about it. No, on the contrary. Having been raised a Roman Catholic Christian in a rural society, even though there were still many traces of animism, surely, and also pagan practices, well, this has had a great impact on my perception of reality while I was growing up, obviously. And I'm sure for most of you, it's also the same situation because most of us have not been born in fully animistic societies or within an indigenous society. And even those who are indigenous peoples are also trying to relearn or at the very least reconnect with the animistic indigenous lifestyle, customs, traditions, even languages and culture in general of their ancestors. So like most of you, I'm also learning, and I'm here today to also learn and share knowledge with you. In fact, since the very beginning of the creation of my YouTube channel, I'm here to exchange knowledge. So I'll try my best to explain what I have learned and the way I have applied that knowledge in a practical way. And by all means, please do share your insights in the comments below. Sadly, I may not have the time to answer all of you, but I do read many of your comments. So please share your knowledge, share the things you have learned, because it will also be useful to others, not just to me, but to others as well. And I know I have a considerable amount of indigenous peoples watching my videos, actually, and that makes me happy and proud. I won't deny it, but also creates a certain level of responsibility. And I'm not here by any means to try to convince you that I've got it all figured out. The only thing I am certain of is that education is a never-ending process. And in order for us to relearn and reconnect to something, especially to a world view, not only we need to completely break our previous perceptions of reality, but we also need each other. We need to exchange knowledge. Anyway, with no more delay, let's start our today's video, please. So let's start with personhood. The starting point is to remember that the basis of an animistic worldview is to know that the world is absolutely populated with persons and that the great majority of these persons are not human persons. Every living entity is a person, therefore it has a personality, an individuality, it has consciousness, displays behavior, it has its own culture. What constitutes a person and indicates what or that which is alive is precisely what demonstrates behavior, shows attitude, shows or displays emotion, is capable of interaction, demonstrates self-awareness, expresses a consciousness, and manifests sensibility. So it is somewhat easy to understand what is or what constitutes a person. A person is something animated. So it's easy to see personhood in animals, for instance, because we can directly interact with them and they display behavior, attitude, personality, and all those things previously pointed out. It becomes less easy to understand and see personhood in trees, hills, mountains, rivers, sky or weather phenomenon, although these do display all the things here mentioned. However, the less contact we have with something, the harder it will be for us to understand and see personhood in it. And it becomes even harder if in our own languages we make clear distinctions between what is assumed to be animated and what is assumed to be inanimate. When we address human persons, we address them generally as he, him, she, her, they, them. We can also do this with animals, although in general the pronouns are different. And in many languages, there is the tendency to dehumanize and even take out personhood from certain animals, and they are addressed as it, as a thing. And the more we distance ourselves from certain entities of the world, and the more we address them as it, as a thing, as something inanimate or incapable of demonstrating behavior, the harder it will be to see personhood in those entities. This is when we come to what I have said on other videos about animism, that for people who are no longer familiar with an animistic worldview, not just in terms of religion, but also in the social behavioral patterns of their societies, clear distinctions between what is animated and what is inanimate are created. And when trying to understand animistic societies, these people often fall into the mistake of seeing animistic societies as societies that think that everything in the world is alive. And that is not true. There is an impulse to think in this way because that's a sort of colonial mentality towards peoples deemed to be inferior or even primitive, childlike, and it became a sort of mockery, demonstrating that animistic societies don't have distinctions between what is alive and what isn't. And so everything is alive, and that's it. It's an easy and lazy way to put it from the part of those who are not familiar with the worldviews of animistic societies. Things are a lot more complex. Animistic societies have clear distinctions and know what is animated and what isn't. In truth, it's the non-animistic societies that are simple, because in such societies, personhood is reduced to a couple of individuals, mostly humans, and it is simplified even by language, and therefore simplified in thought. And most of our perception comes from the way we name and address things in the world. Animism is highly complex, precisely because personhood is extended to a variety of individuals, which non-animistic societies normally understand as things, as inanimate matter. So we come to what I've been saying sometimes, and perhaps this is the opportunity to explore that a bit. In animism, not every rock is alive, but some are. Not everything is alive, but many things are. It's a question of distinguishing what is animated and what is inanimate. And in order for us to know that, we seek what shows or displays that list of factors I've previously given. But not everything will immediately display all these things. Not every rock will do that, but some rocks will. So how do we know a rock or any other object has personhood, is endowed with personhood? How do we know if it is alive, if it is animated, if it contains an entity or part of an entity, or if it has power in it? And to answer this, we must put aside our usual conceptions of gods, spirits, invisible others, the invisible populations of the world. Animism is highly practical, and every system of belief and or practice that has an animistic perception will also be highly practical, like paganism, witchcraft, shamanism. Every interaction with the visible and the invisible populations of the world were and are highly practical. Building relationships with persons, taking actions, display of a practical behavior towards persons in order to build relationship, and from that relationship receive something beneficial. And sometimes we forget this about animism and have the tendency to romanticize it as hugging trees and walking barefoot all over the place. Mind you that there's nothing wrong in hugging trees and walking barefoot and feeling the earth beneath your feet. I highly recommend that you do that, and it's extremely beneficial. However, animism is not about hugging trees and believing that everything is alive. Animism is about recognizing what is animated, what has personhood, therefore it can be interacted with and it can interact. And the relationship can be created to obtain something beneficial. Something beneficial doesn't have to be some sort of blessing you get or power or something that enhances your health. Something beneficial can very well be avoiding disease, a death, disaster. You build a relationship with, let's say, as an example, a dangerous entity. You build a relationship with an entity that serves as the intermediate between you and the dangerous entity to avoid harm from that dangerous entity. Not everything in the world will give you something positive, and not everything will want to interact with you in a good way or any way at all. And indeed, you don't want to have interactions with every entity of the world. So, much of the practical actions within animism towards entities of the world is to avoid harm, is to avoid damage or harm that can come from anything and everything. The animistic society will not have a concrete dualistic idea of what is good and what is evil, because every person of the world can be both and can display both beneficial and harmful actions. Instead, there is the recognition that each person has its own individuality, its own behavioral patterns, its own personality, and will act in a variety of ways, often unpredictable. So the animistic individual, as well as the pagan, the witch, and the shaman, know that the entities of the world, the invisible others, and nature itself, and other humans, human persons, can be cruel at times, can be dangerous, unpredictable. There are predators out there. There are violent deaths and atrocities. But what the person with animistic perceptions of the world and all life can do and will do is to try to find ways to mitigate damage, working towards resolutions and find ways to minimize as much as possible all the conflict and harm, all the damage that can be caused. And this leads the animistic individual to have practical actions to display a pragmatic behavior in order to build boundaries, build relationships, to avoid or minimize damage and harm that can affect the individual and its community. This is one of the biggest problems in most modern societies, especially non-animistic societies. Not enough practice or no practice at all. Not enough action. Not enough practical behavior towards the building of relationships. And therefore, if there is no desire to build relationships, then it will increase the amount of damage and harm to which we are all subjected to. Conflicts will increase and will spread. And that was, in my honest opinion, one of the great mistakes of our societies through time. Because we went from belief systems that were highly pragmatic, and the entire intention was to build relationships, to belief systems and religions that started to rely on the omnipresence and omnipotence of gods. And this made us lazy and broke the understanding of what constitutes personhood. Let me explain. At a certain point in history, many human societies started to develop a very different understanding of supernatural and invisible others, namely in relation to entities understood to be deities. In the development of religion, especially within centers of political power, there was a bigger focus on gods, while other entities of the world were progressively put aside, even forgotten. Gods became the sole focus of religion as the entities that maintain order within the human society, while the peoples outside the centers of power continue to have their own displays of faith and systems of belief, still very much pragmatic. As a god or gods became more important, so did their powers, until specific institutions were created to control the religious panorama, and therefore faith and belief was displayed by the authorities who controlled religion. People were now less interested in having a more direct and personified contact with deities, as they now had someone else to do it for them, the religious authority. And at the same time, it was built the idea of omnipresence and omnipotence of gods. Many societies started to take for granted that the gods are omnipresent. That is, the condition of being constantly encountered anywhere at every time. Therefore, people expect a deity to hear them all the time, help them to show itself, to manifest itself in some way at that moment, anywhere, at any occasion. Such is the nature of the Abrahamic God, as an example. But this has also happened with many pagan gods within many pagan societies. Not only gods became omnipresent, they also became omnipotent. That is, having unlimited power, able to do anything. From the moment a deity is understood to be present at any time, everywhere, and able to do anything, people expect that same deity to act in whichever way people want, every time they want and every time they need. So it became expected that a deity should be there at all times, in any occasion. It was taken for granted the existence of deities and that such existence can be manifested whenever. And this understanding not only is the destruction of the understanding of personhood, but also the very destruction of gods and therefore the destruction of belief systems. Because when you expect a deity to be there all the time and manifest itself in every way, and in fact that deity displays no manifestations whatsoever, this leads to the conclusion that deities do not exist, because how could they if they did not manifest themselves as we expected them to? Clearly, they do not exist, and this leads to atheism. Many societies, especially when animistic worldviews started to be put aside in favor of a religious focus on deities, have completely lost the knowledge on how to communicate with the invisible others and how to make them manifest themselves to us, and perhaps most importantly, us to them. One of the reasons why animistic societies are highly pragmatic is precisely because there is no concrete conception of at least omnipresence of gods and other entities from whom we require something, with whom we want to build a relationship. If we remember that the world is populated with persons, we understand that these invisible others are persons, just the same way as we are persons. We understand there are limitations, there are boundaries. We understand that such invisible others also have their own communities, personalities, their own behavior. In animism, nothing can be demanded from an entity, from any other person. The building of relationships is through reasoning and bargaining with persons. This is a strong reason why animistic societies are highly pragmatic. For instance, why a spiritual leader, let's use the general term shaman for a better understanding. Well, the shaman beats the drum for many minutes, hours, and even days to call upon a specific entity. The witch sets out into a sacred place or builds a sacred place, brings the tools, or builds the rituals, starts the chant, song, conjuring, summoning, says the words, places the objects, waits, tries again, does it all over again, what it takes to cause the manifestation of the entity from whom something is required. The animistic person uses a prayer, continuously speaking the words for several days. There's ritual, there's the construction of object, there's a pattern, there's a constant behavior, taking action. Why is this? Because the invisible others are not omnipresent. They are persons of the world, and if we want to build any relationship with them, we must call upon them. Why do we call upon them? Because they don't know we exist unless we show them that we are in there, that we exist. It's not waiting for a deity to manifest itself to us. We too must manifest ourselves to that deity. How else will that deity know we are there or that we even exist? It's not simply going into a place deemed to be sacred and expect anything to happen. If you do not let yourself be known to the spirits of place, why should they interact with you if you do not state your purpose and show yourself? This is animism in its very basic sense, of course. How does a god become a god in the first place? Because it was found out or manifested itself to someone or some community. Gods are entities of the world, of a specific place or even weather phenomena. Most are persons of specific land features. Just a side note, in fact, I very much doubt that animistic societies had conceptions of gods or godhood, and that in fact a conception of a deity was introduced to them by colonialism and the idea of an all-powerful, all-seeing and all-present God. Because animism deals with persons, some are more powerful than others. A question of powerful spirits and less powerful spirits, or better still, powerful and less powerful persons. Let's say there's a person of a specific hill, and in that hill inhabits a person and an entity. And the human community builds a relationship with this entity of the hill, of the place. Interaction is established, and the more the human community interacts with this entity of the hill, the more likely it is to create a custom, a tradition. It became a generational behavior, and therefore a cult is established to that entity of place. A cult to that entity of the hill is established because there was a continuous generational interaction with the entity. And this cult, in the eyes of colonizers who had a very different conception of godhood, saw in the extensive cult of this entity of the hill the worship of a god. They saw the worship of a god of this indigenous animistic society or community. It may never have been considered a god to the animistic community, but instead a powerful spirit of the hill, familiar and dear to the community, a protector, a guardian, an ancestral person of the community. But from the eyes of those whose religious understandings are entirely around the conception of a god, saw in this great display of practical behavior towards an invisible other from the part of the indigenous community, they saw the worship of a god, and therefore it is assumed that this person of the hill, of the place, is a god to this indigenous animistic community. The same way it is assumed that ancient pagans worshipped many gods, when in fact their entire belief systems were still very much animistic, and it may always have been a case of creating relationships with persons of the world, with invisible others, the invisible communities. Because indeed most mythologies about pagan peoples, pagan cultures, not only were written in periods when pagan traditions had already been subjugated to monotheistic religious beliefs and very different beliefs than the pagan ones, but such mythological accounts were also written by people whose understandings of religion were focused on the conception of godhood. But that's something to explore another time. The point here is that the omnipresence and omnipotence of deities destroys the understanding of personhood. Because if we simply expect a deity to show up because it is omnipresent and omnipotent, we will be very much disappointed. But in animism, knowing, not believing, but knowing that gods are no more than persons of the world, more than human persons, that is more powerful than the human persons, then all the efforts from the part of the human community to contact with the invisible others will be a lot more pragmatic, because the human community will need to literally seek out the invisible other or others, make themselves be known, show intention, show that they want to build a relationship, they want contact. And for that, there's the beating of the drum, there's the ritual, there's the creation of an object or objects, there's song, chant, summoning, prayer, consumption of certain foods, or of course, abstaining from the consumption of certain foods. Whatever it takes to let yourself be known, and the intentions and the relationship that one wants to build or try to build to obtain something beneficial. This is how in animism there is an attempt to understand the personhood in all things. From the moment we understand personhood and where it resides and in what it resides in, we start to build a relationship with that person. Relationship is fundamental, and the creation of a talisman is a practical behavior towards a person with whom you have already built a relationship. That's somewhat the idea of a familiar spirit, right? An entity with whom you have built a relationship, reasoned with, bargained with, coming to an agreement that is beneficial for both parties. When you create a talisman, the object becomes the tool with which you build a relationship. A talisman is often an object created for an apotropaic purpose, but not just and not only. It can have a multitude of functions, but the point of its creation is to maintain a relationship with something and for something. It can contain personhood, it can contain part of personhood or part of the power of that person, or it can contain part of your own power because you two are a person of the world interacting with invisible and visible others, invisible and visible persons, creating a relationship or relationships. And this is often called fetishism, although personally I avoid using that term for a variety of reasons, two of which it's because it's highly derogatory, but also because applying a term to this practice is creating a separation in the very animistic understanding, as if fetishism was some sort of work or job or art sprouting from animism, but somehow in a subcategory, which it isn't. Fetishism is already very much present within an animistic life. It's the creation of an inanimate object or objects, transforming something inanimate into something animated. An object having personhood or part of personhood, and also the power of that person, so it can be used for an intended purpose. A talisman in animism is no more than a social agent. From the moment you use it for the interaction and the building of relationships with persons and powers, it becomes an object different than all the other objects because it doesn't have the average utility, but instead it becomes an agent through which you build relationships. Let's say a spoon. Its average utility is to aid you in the consumption of liquids. But if it becomes a tool, a social agent, a talisman, its function is no longer the same. It's no longer an utensil, no longer inanimate, but now a social agent, an animated object. It contains personhood. Its purpose is to build relationships, and the fact that you use it for that, you are already building a relationship with the object itself, making the object animated because it contains your personhood, your power and intention, and you use this object of power towards an intended purpose. The object becomes a talisman. It becomes intentionally a material embodiment. Because you, as a human person, you have an intention, and the intentionality of human persons affects objects that are used in a cultural way as social agents, and in this way the objects become subjects. The object is made to act intentionally as a social agent to build relationship and interaction between you and another. In this way, we understand, to a certain extent, fetishism within animistic societies, the same way we understand the use of a knife or a dagger in witchcraft ritual, or a chalice or any other object, and the very drum of the shaman. A shaman's drum is often referred to as an individual, as a person, as a living thing, because it is not an ordinary object, because it is made to be a social agent through which the intention of a human person is expressed towards others, to call upon others, summon them, calling for the aid, waking up spirits, conducting spirits, receiving possession of spirit. The drum itself contains purpose, behavior, intention. It is a social agent. It has personhood or part of personhood. It has power in it. Therefore, it is animated to a certain extent, which makes the drum more than an object, more than an utensil or a tool. It becomes a container of power and personhood. That's the same with a talisman. It ceases to be an ordinary inanimate object from the moment it becomes a social agent through which intentionally it is expressed something, and it is used to work on and build relationships with visible and invisible others. Objects play a fundamental role in the building of relationships within animistic societies, which is why many religions fail to build relationships with gods and other entities, because there is usually an abandonment of an animistic perception that leads to the abandonment of the material aspects of life. You see this quite a lot in religions whose entire spiritual focus is on life elsewhere out of this world. Spiritualities that strive to create an abandonment of the material world, not just the abandonment of spaces, physical spaces, but also a lifetime of trying to disengage from material objects and breaking relationships with people, because the focus is on an eternal life elsewhere without the need of material objects and earthly relationships. And in my opinion, that is a grave mistake, because in an animistic mentality, objects are essential to build relationships, but also relationships themselves with visible and invisible others are essential to maintain balance, to maintain the cycles of life flowing, and to strengthen life itself to prevent harm and damage. Relationships are fundamental to minimize the harm and damage we are all subjected to, because we live in this world, and from the moment we live in this world, we are all vulnerable to all sorts of things, and harm, damage, disease, death, and predators are very real. It's not a fairy tale. Let's not romanticize it. Life can be cruel at times. Life can be hard at times, and anyone saying otherwise is trying to sell you something. So, the animistic person does what it takes not to end the chaotic, dangerous, and harmful aspects of life, but at the very least to minimize all of the damage, doing something, taking action. And for that, we build relationships with each other and amongst ourselves. We build relationships with the visible and the invisible populations of the world. We cannot count on the idea of omnipresence and omnipotence of deities, because that is a religious reality outside, completely outside animism, that has proven that it actually breaks relationships, destroys belief, and leaves the world more vulnerable to all sorts of damage. So the animistic person does require the material objects that serve as social agents to start, to build, to maintain and strengthen and even renew relationships. So, after all that has been said, and I try to explain as best as I can, as you might imagine, it is not easy to explain something practical that depends a lot on a worldview quite different from the one we are used to in modern Western societies, at least. But after all of this, I think that in this entire speech I have developed in here, the bases were created to understand the need to turn some mundane objects into magic tools, or in other words, turning objects into animated entities in part and containing power and turning them into social agents. All of this understanding that is put into practice through several different rituals. Rituals being precisely a pragmatic act for building relationships, and rituals towards objects will generate a talisman or amulet. Amulet or talisman being practically the same thing, and etymologically, both words denote an object which may or may not have inscriptions in it or on it, which is carried by someone for the purpose of protection or for some kind of blessing. To establish and conduct something beneficial for the person who possesses the talisman. Talismans are the embodiment of a concept, an idea, and an intention. It is a material embodiment. Clearly, the talisman has a body, which is the object itself, the material itself. In a way, it contains conscious as well, which is the purpose for which it was created. And it also contains a spirit, a power, which is the will of the person who uses it. But not only. From the moment a relationship is established with an entity through a mutual understanding, that entity can inhabit in part or in totality the object itself, so that it provides the effect for which the object was created. The material and the way the objects are consecrated, the rituals, the decorative aspects, whether they have inscriptions or not, all of this depends on traditions or in the belief systems. But the basis remains the same. It is a material embodiment, a social agent. It is affected by the intentionality of human persons. But not all amulets last forever. In reality, amulets or talismans, being endowed with personhood, having animation, will only exist for a while because they are alive. Relationships break, they change, everything changes. We cannot take anything for granted. When we create a relationship with someone, if we don't take care of that relationship, sooner or later it will break and it will dissipate. As I've mentioned in one of my most recent videos on annual or yearly celebrations and festivals, in essence, these celebrations and festivals throughout the year are rituals with the objective to maintain and reinforce the annual relationships we have with all the entities of the world from which or from whom we receive something beneficial. Every year, a celebration in honor of the harvest, as an example, as an annual ritual to maintain, reinforce, or even renew the relationships that had been created with the entities that helped in the fertility of the soils in the previous year through the same ritual in the form of celebration. That is why many amulets or talismans have a lifetime until they stop working. They will act on a certain issue or for a certain period, and then they will return to being common objects. For example, Asian traditions often make talismans during the Lunar New Year, which marks the beginning of a new cycle. And the effects of those talismans or the powers will act on the specific action for which they have been created. And when the talismans accomplished the thing for which they were created or made for, they cease to have a function. So talismans can continue to be used for the same purpose in a new cycle if we renew the relationship through ritual. Or they may have a different effect depending on the intention you want to give and the construction of a new relationship with entities through which we require help or power from. Or talismans can simply be destroyed, which we also see in many societies. The ritual and the symbolic burial or cremation of objects that no longer serve their purpose because there is a break in the relationship and the object is no longer a social agent. It ceases to be a material embodiment. Or are even buried or cremated with the person it belonged to. Just like what I've explained on the video about the troll cross and the elf cross in Scandinavian traditional folk magic. Objects that work as talismans or amulets that cannot be given or used by another person once they have already been used by someone else. A relationship was created between object and person, or the object binds the relationship between human person and invisible others. The object is a social agent maintaining a relationship between persons. So it won't have effect on another person that was never part of this relationship unless the talisman goes back to being an object and another person uses the object and through ritual uses it as a new social agent in a new relationship between human person and an invisible other or others. But generally speaking, talismans or amulets are destroyed through ritual and or ceremony to release any remaining power, animation, and personhood that might still be in there, thus concluding their cycle of existence. And also marking the end of a moment in our lives and the transition for a new phase or a new cycle. Archaeologically speaking, indeed, we do find quite a few objects of these in cremations or burials, not only of people and therefore the objects accompany the deceased, but often these talismanic objects are alone and were purposely buried, destroyed, broken, or burned in ritual or ceremony in a symbolic act of death of the object, ceasing to be a social agent or a material embodiment, and thus becoming normal mundane objects. But this destruction or burial that marks the death of an object also serves to prevent it from being used again by another person, by another individual, because it can cause various types of damage or harm. Again, it's all about minimizing damage as much as possible. All right, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope it was useful in any way. I hope the concepts I have shared with you in here might be useful in the creation of talismans and other things to explore in the world of animism and witchcraft and shamanism, paganism, etc. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tá por aí. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje.